Hello, friends, and welcome to the PrepWell podcast. I'm your host, Phil Black. And if you have an 8th, 9th, or 10th grader with big aspirations, like the Ivy League, or military service academies like West Point, ROTC, or athletic scholarships, boom, you've come to the right place. My specialty, my superpower, if you will, is preparing families for these competitive programs. I'll teach you what your child should do, when they should do it, and how you can help. So stick around and prepare to out-prepare. Hello, friends, and welcome back to the PrepWell podcast. In today's episode, I want to go over the section of the Common Application that I think takes a lot of people by surprise, both students and parents, and that's the Extracurricular Activity section. I know there's often a lot of chatter about extracurriculars during the years, but in my experience, when many students begin to fill out their application, often at the beginning of senior year, many are in for a rude awakening. That is, of course, unless they've been enrolled in PrepWell Academy, because I go over how to build your extracurricular profile over and over and over again during our weekly lessons starting in 9th grade. But I digress. If you don't have that early heads up and you're just going about your business, it can be intimidating. Even for students who are kind of on the ball, but not 100% focused, this section can throw them for a loop. What do I mean by that? Well, when you get to the extracurricular section of the application, you will see 10 blank spaces. That is 10 spots to enter the activities you've been involved with since 9th grade. And even for a relatively engaged student, sometimes they struggle to fill in these blanks. Or they start to really have to stretch what qualifies as an extracurricular activity. And these days, especially when it comes to the more selective schools, that's not going to fly. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a student who plays soccer year-round, and she's very good. At least she was up until high school, so she plays both on a club team and the high school team. She's also the vice president of the photography club. She started a chess club. She works periodically at a soup kitchen, works part-time as a babysitter, and does some after-school tutoring. She and her parents probably feel like she's pretty busy. Year-round soccer is an all-consuming activity and leaves her very little time to breathe. She's involved in a few clubs. She does volunteer work. She even has a part-time job. What more do colleges want from her? She seems like she's busy all the time. Well, it turns out that most of the more selective schools are looking for considerably more, in part because they see many other competitive students doing a lot more. When this student starts to fill out her extracurricular activity section on her college application, she basically has 6 things to include on her list. And even that might be a stretch. She has her sport, soccer, which obviously is a significant activity. She's in 2 clubs, has done some volunteer work, and has some part-time work. Even if she could stretch each of those things into something that sounded more significant than they really were, she would still have 4 blanks left. That's almost half the section left blank. That's not good. This is normally when the panic sets in. What do I do now? I'm a senior. I thought I've been really busy, but my application is actually looking pretty skimpy. Now, if you're not keeping track of the number and significance and duration of your activities from early on, it's very easy to fall into this trap. You feel like you've been super busy. You took all these AP classes and got great grades. You did well on the SAT. You played soccer 6 days a week for the last 10 years. But now you're coming up dry in the extracurricular activity section. How could this be? This is not a great situation. And I see a lot of students in this predicament. And it's mostly due to not really paying attention to what matters most when it matters. And right or wrong, a lot of this stuff happens in 9th and 10th grade. And if you miss that window and you're not aware about how all of this stuff works, then you can end up with a strong application, but not one that's going to stand out. And by then, it's often too late. So the question is, how should I manage my extracurricular activities? How do I get to 10 meaningful activities? How should I spread them out? When should I start? How can I avoid showing up as a senior with a half-baked extracurricular activities list? Let me run through some tips. Tip number 1, enroll in PrepWell Academy as a freshman. This should be a given. This is one of the main benefits of the course. I give you a heads up every week about these types of things, and I encourage you to think about your extracurricular profile and how it might develop over time so you're not blindsided. Now, whether or not you act on this advice is up to you, but at least you will know what you're up against. Tip number 2, make your summers count. Think about it. If you do one significant extracurricular activity during the summer after 9th, 10th, and 11th grade, that's 3 high-quality activities. Boom, right off the bat. And these can be high-impact activities because you have so much time during the summer. And if you want even more credit, you'll try to align these activities with what you plan to study in college. This is where you get major bonus points when it comes to building a theme. Let me give you a quick example of a few summer activities that my sons did to try to build this theme. They both wanted to do Navy ROTC in college, and ROTC programs really value leadership, academics, athletics, outdoor aptitude. So their goal was to do activities that demonstrated interest and competence in these areas. So here were their 3 summer activities. Summer number 1, after 9th grade, spend 1 month in Brazil working as a day laborer on a cocoa bean farm 10 hours a day, picking and sorting cocoa beans, fixing farm equipment, struggling with a foreign language. Summer number 2, complete their Eagle Scout project, which included installing fences and planter boxes and putting together rabbit hutches. And summer number 3, reading the top 20 books on military leadership. Now, this happened to be during the height of COVID, and this is what we call a self-directed study activity, where you do it on your own. You make something up on your own, especially when everything was shut down. Each of these activities was significant in its own way and aligned with their goals. But these ideas, they don't happen in a vacuum. We had to sit down and think about how to lay out these activities, oftentimes years ahead of time. This type of planning doesn't happen by accident. Tip number 3, stick with a few ongoing core activities. In the case study we've been talking about, soccer would be that type of activity, and she would get a lot of credit for dedicating so much time to her sport. And by the way, we're assuming here that this girl was not good enough to be a recruited athlete for college for soccer. Admissions officers like to see duration, what we call duration, in some of your activities, meaning they like to see that you've done a particular activity for 2, 3, 4 years straight instead of just for a few months. Tip number 4, try to make an impact. Simply being a participant or a member of a club doesn't really give you that much credit because anybody could probably have joined the club. What did you do in the club? Were you a leader, a founder? How many members were in the club? What did the club actually accomplish, if anything? Tip number 5, shoot for alignment. We touched on this already a bit. If you end up spending time in a bunch of smaller activities where you're not necessarily a leader, it would be nice if those activities were related to what you wanted to study or major in college, as opposed to just a collection of unrelated activities. This is called alignment. If an admissions officer can spot a trend or a theme in your activities, this will be a big plus. And lastly, tip number 6, consider one-offs. A one-off activity could be a discrete activity that's unrelated to school or academics that really stands out. For example, let's say you were tracking to become an engineer and you spent 2 years restoring an old car you got from a junkyard into a fully functioning show-ready vehicle. That would be very impressive. Not only is it unique and aligned with being an engineer, but it requires a lot of discipline and skill. So as you can see, you don't always have to be part of a larger group or a team or an organization or a school, not by a long shot. I've recommended a ton of these one-off activity ideas to my private PrepWellers, especially during COVID, that turned out to be fantastic personal passion projects. The bottom line is this: you don't want to begin your senior year with just a few extracurricular activities to your credit. You don't want to stare at those 10 open spots and wonder how you're going to fill them in. You want to have a lot of strong activities to choose from and pick your top 10. But once again, most students don't just luck into this. It happens because you're aware that this stuff matters, which is where PrepWell Academy comes in. And you're motivated enough to act on it, which is where you come in. And you're able to plan for it, which is often where your parents come in. Sit down with your parents, ideally after 8th grade, and try to come up with a straw man of what you might want to do for the next few years. If you're older than a rising freshman, there's no time like the present to start strategizing. What can you do? What opportunities are available? What can you do on your own? Especially now that the world has opened back up. If you've been in a rut, it's time to get out of it. Now, I also want to throw 2 caveats out there. Number 1, this advice assumes that you want to be a competitive applicant at a selective school. If you plan to go to the local college where they don't put as much emphasis on extracurriculars, then it may not be such a big deal. Obviously, if you're shooting for the Ivies or the near Ivies or service academies or ROTC programs where there are fewer and fewer objective measures to assess, you really have to have your extracurricular activities dialed in. The second caveat has to do with athletic recruiting. If you are an elite athlete who intends to be recruited by coaches to play your sport in college, then your extracurricular activities list will not be quite as important. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're a legitimate Division I prospect, it normally means that you spend so much time on your sport that you physically don't have the time to rack up a bunch of other significant ECAs, or extracurricular activities. And colleges won't necessarily hold that against you. As long as you have reasonable grades and class rigor and standardized test scores, many colleges will not worry too much about your ECA list. That is, if you're a recruitable athlete. However, be careful about committing to this strategy, because if you think you're on track to be a Division I athlete, and thus you decide that you don't have time to run around like a chicken with its head cut off, doing all kinds of significant and long duration and high impact and themed extracurricular activities, but you don't ever become a recruited athlete for whatever reason, then you could be stuck. Because while you were playing soccer or lacrosse or water polo or football, the other kids were racking up activities and fine-tuning them, and you were not. So it's a bit of a high-risk, high-reward proposition. If you bet on yourself athletically and let the other stuff slide, you better produce. Or at least understand that it's a risk and it's a risk worth taking, and you'll have to deal with the consequences if it doesn't work out. And hopefully that's more motivating than it is anxiety-producing. So make sure you talk with your coaches early in the game and get an idea about how much potential you have in your sport before you decide to throttle back on everything else. This caveat, by the way, applies to non-athletes as well, who may be very angular in their profile, but in a different way. Maybe they're an artist or a young business mogul, entrepreneur, or a published author. If you're very angular like this, you too may not need to have such a finely tuned extracurricular list. If you're not one of these outliers, however, it would behoove you to spend some time trying to optimize your extracurricular list, especially these days when there are so few other items for your admissions officer to grasp onto. No more SAT and ACT score if you choose not to submit one. No more SAT subject tests. No more essay section on the SAT. GPAs are basically irrelevant these days. Some schools no longer require letters of recommendation. So what are you left with? Extracurricular activities. They're becoming more and more important. So make sure you're paying close attention to your PrepWell lessons. Ask your parents for some help. Get me on the phone for a consultation. Do something. And of course, if you're not yet a PrepWeller, do that too. That's all I've got for you today, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you for the continued support. If you do know a parent with an 8th grader, 9th grader, 10th grader in high school that might find this episode helpful, please share it with them. You can do that by finding that small box with the tiny arrow that points up. That's the share button. Click that button and text your friends the link to this episode with a little personal note from you recommending that they give it a listen. If you have questions, comments, or an idea for an upcoming episode, please reach out to me by email. DM me on Instagram, PrepWell_Academy. Check out our blog, Facebook. Connect with me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you. Until next week, goodbye, good luck, and never stop preparing. This podcast is brought to you by PrepWell Academy. PrepWell Academy is my one-of-a-kind online mentoring program that delivers to your 9th or 10th grader a short, highly relevant video from me every week, every Sunday in fact, where I give them a heads up about what they should be thinking about to stay ahead of the game. To get these valuable lessons into your child's hands, please head over to PrepWellAcademy.com and enroll your child today.